Hello, this is Sheila Bender, and you're listening to In Conversation, discussions on writing and the writing life. Today, we have with us in the studio Port Angeles poet Alice Derry. I'm really happy to be able to talk with her in person about poetry and her career in poetry and her poems. What has been said of her poems is that they are honest in their conception and execution. They make a claim on my interest right away. That's Raymond Carver. Lysel Mueller has said, "This is the work of a clear-voiced, clear-sighted poet who loves the world deeply." And Lee Young Lee has written that her poems are written with a personal life at stake. These poems achieve a transpersonal significance and beauty. Alice Derry was born in Oregon and raised in Washington and Montana. She received her MFA from Goddard College, now Warren Wilson College, in 1980, taught by poets William Matthews, Lysel Mueller, and Louise Gluck. She published 7 books of poetry. Strangers Through Their Courage was a finalist for the Washington Book Award in 2002. Tremolo came out from Red Hen Press most recently. After 37 years teaching writing and literature, she retired from Peninsula College in Port Angeles, Washington, where she also led for more than a quarter of a century the Foothills Writers Series, hosting about 15 readings a year. I also know from discussion before we sat down before the microphones that she has a new manuscript of poems that she just learned will be out soon. Welcome, Alice.
Thank you so much, Sheila, for having me here today.
So let's start with the new manuscript information.
Yeah, so exciting. This is a manuscript entitled Hunger, and it's going to be published by Moonpath Press, and that's a little press in Tillamook, Oregon. That's run by Alana Hechtman-Ayers. So that should be out maybe a year from now, about what we're looking at.
So it's back to your roots. You were born in Oregon.
Yeah. Oregon has treated me well in my publishing life,
Oh.
I have to say. My first book, Stages of Twilight, is also out of Oregon, and I have a chapbook out of Oregon.
So you never left Oregon in
No,
some ways.
I never left Oregon.
That's wonderful.
I still feel that way. I have a lot of...
Well, as long as we're talking about the new manuscript, I think you have a poem here with you that's from that manuscript. It would be delightful to hear it.
Okay, this poem is called Shelter, and it was after I read an article in the Lewiston Morning Tribune out of Lewiston, Idaho, where my folks ended up living in the last part of their lives, that I wrote the poem, and it quotes the sheriff that article was about quite extensively, and I thought it was an important poem to read today given where we are politically right now. This is called Shelter. The sheriff dares to speak of the young girls, 12, who offer themselves, the fatherless girls whose mothers are husbandless, abandoned, or abandoning, like houses overrun by flood. They are looking for a man to keep them, he says, looking for safekeeping. From the internet, he goes on, from the magazines, they know how to fashion themselves to be irresistible, to offer what will be taken. At a party, he is quoted, these girls go from man to man, asking to give oral sex. And the young men, 19, take. The sheriff dares to feel sorry even for the men, unsure of the law, unaware of what they are taking. And they are going to prison for statutory rape, for indecency with a minor. The girls will tell you, the sheriff dares to say, no one was forced. All of this was consensual. The girls think of themselves only as body, as the dark opening of a listing barn, or as that which is entered because there's room. Since the parents' arms are lost, which might have closed around them and absorbed space as a tree can hold off rain, taking it into its branches. Past 12, childhood is lost. I will go to these girls, the newspaper quotes the sheriff. I will teach them, and I believe his kind intent. I will teach them to teach their parents. The sheriff, remembering his own young manhood, fragility he admits to no one, since his mother, who might have honored it, wasn't there. That he could retrieve what he has lost, what we are all losing, our girls, our young men. Here in the newspaper, Sheriff, I'm reading your fervency, burning into what you must know. Those who have never felt asylum can't teach it. A door opens into a room bright with firelight and comfortable chairs where someone says, "Speak to me, tell me." And a shoulder friendly as a harbor's lee offers what doesn't have to be returned. Closeness in which the body, imitative, becomes unassailable. It's self-sanctuary.
Oh, breathtaking and so inclusive. That sheriff is a hero.
He is a hero.
Thank you. You taught for 37 years at the same school, and I know what good work you did there. So, what's it like now, not having that identity every day?
Well, you said if I had had more time, did I have more time for writing poetry, and did I have more time for giving my own readings? And the answers were yes and yes.
How delightful.
I did retire somewhat early, very intentionally, and the intention was to finally be able to write full-time, something I hadn't been able to do for my whole life, and it has been very wonderful.
Do you find that because your time was so compressed before, that there's like a surge of poetry, that you're just ripe and ready?
I think, yes, hunger was produced certainly out of that surge. And when I retired, I hadn't yet published Tremolo, and so I worked on that too. I don't think any of that would have come so quickly or so well, really, so deeply, if I hadn't been retired.
There are people who say having deadlines really helps, or having to work against something that's keeping us from what we're compelled to say really works. And 37 years is a long time. And it's wonderful to hear that right now you're writing a lot.
Yeah.
And publishing it quickly.
Well, I don't know about quickly.
Well,
but
I mean,
anyway.
the book seems to have come fairly quickly after the retirement.
Tremolo, and after,
Good. How about style? Do you think that your poems have changed over the years?
Your question was interesting because it made me go back and look through some of my older work, which I maybe hadn't looked at really carefully for a while. And it's interesting to me that the themes that I care about are already in stages of twilight. When they're reading this poem, Shelter, and I realized I had poems in stages of twilight that had the same impulse. But overwriting has always been an issue for me, and it's not a good sin for a poet where poems need to be spare and have their white space. And so I think my poems are less overwritten. I think they're less sentimental than they might have been, and especially more clearly worked out in language, something that I've had a lot more time for since I retired. And language is poetry's home, and it needs to drive poems forward, and therefore it needs close attention. And I think I've been able to do that better.
Listening to you, I realize what an honor it is as a listener to know a person's body of work, and to have your own experience of the more youthful end of the spectrum of the poems to the other ones. Because part of what you say about not overwriting, I think some of that comes with not only the confidence of language, having worked with it for so many years, but confidence of living and being more sure. Not that you start a poem because you're sure of anything. I mean, you start a poem to find out what you might be thinking or feeling.
Sure.
But I think the tentativeness with which we might write when we're younger maybe goes away and changes into something else.
Yeah. And because you know that you have done it, you can do it again, and you're not so anxious. And I think that can really help you to focus in on language and forget about all these worries that you might have that you couldn't write a poem.
Right. And some of what we worry about is who is going to want to read this poem, and why would it even matter if I wrote this poem? Yeah. But as you get older and you've had more success and you've done more readings and had more response from listeners and readers, you kind of know it might not be a million people. It's poetry after all. But there are certainly people for whom the poems have changed lives. Overwritten slightly or not, that's still that magic still happens.
I couldn't agree with you more.
So let's go way back to the beginning. How did you come to writing poetry?
I was spending quite a bit of time thinking about that. Even though my mother was an English teacher, had been before I was born, I didn't really have a childhood that would have led to poetry very much. But maybe I was always tending that way. Certainly from the very beginning, I was interested in words and I was interested in literature. And that's always been with me. But I really didn't come to serious writing of poetry until my late 20s. And I still remember this moment when I was sitting with a friend, and I was already teaching. By the way, I did teach for 10 years in a school in Illinois before I came to Peninsula, and that's where this all happened. And she was still kind of trying to figure out what she wanted to do with her life. And she said, well, what do you want to do with your life? And I said, well, I want to write poems. And that was the first time I really knew that myself. But since that moment, there has never been a time when I was not working toward that, writing poems.
So you landed at a school kind of far away from a lot of the centers of writing. Port Angeles,
Sure.
Washington, out there on the tip, almost the tip. How has it been for you being a poet in that locale?
Well, even though Port Angeles is known for being a logging town or a fishing town or a working class town, and probably true, it has a lot of writers in it. A lot of them have been very supportive of me, and it's been a great atmosphere to write in. The landscape that surrounds me is extremely important to my work, and so Port Angeles was ideal. I don't think I knew that. I thought I was aiming for Seattle when I moved out here, but I couldn't find work, so I thought, oh, this is really close to Seattle. Of course, it's not, but I didn't know that then. I think having Seattle close is helpful, but really, since I couldn't get to the writers that well, I brought the writers to Peninsula College, and that made all the difference.
Yes, because you got to know them and shared that with so many other people. I've been to some of those readings when I did live in Seattle, made the back and forth in one evening in order to hear them. And you also probably changed the landscape of the non-writers out there in Port Angeles.
I hope so.
Yeah,
I hope so. And I feel like Port Angeles has been very good to me in terms of being a poet. I have a lot of people who come to my readings, like my work, and so I've always felt nurtured there. And maybe it was easier not having quite as much competition as is in the Seattle area, where there's a huge concentration of writers.
Well, yes, I would say competition not because of the quality of the poetry. Yours is so exquisite, but just because people can't come to everything. There's so much happening.
Sure.
But it's a fabulous thing for a town to sort of own their poet. I love that.
I agree. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very nice.
So I'm glad it's been so good. As a teacher, you probably think back to your own teachers. I don't know who they were, but you can tell us about them and what valuable lessons they shared with you.
Yeah. Well, formally, as I think you might have mentioned there in your introduction, when I got my MFA, I've studied first with William Matthews, then with Liesl Mueller, and then with Louise Gluck. It was good learning for me because, well, none of those poets write the way I do, but except for Liesl Mueller, it wasn't really a personal friendship. And the poems were quite different, and I learned a lot from just that kind of experience of different voices. One thing is this whole idea of establishing a manner in which poems will come to you. I mean, you could just put it as practice, practice, practice. You can't expect poetry to just kind of descend on you. You've got to figure out a way to make it happen and then keep working on that. And I think they all were find the way that works for you and then do it over and over and over again.
What was a way that they expressed, or you?
Well, I don't remember their methods at this point. I only know how I turned that into, for me, a regular time to write is always important. I can't always I'd like to be William Stafford and write every single day, but I don't. And I try not to feel bad about that either. But I do have a place to write, and I like to write in the mornings. And anytime I do get to the desk in the mornings, then that's sort of, you get into your mode, and that's when the poems come and the work gets done. And that's been the most helpful for me. I'm not one of these people who writes from midnight to 4 a.m. or anything like that. A lot of people get up out of bed really early and say, okay, I'm right close to my dreams now, I'm going to write. No, coffee, you got to have breakfast. And then we come to the poems. I know that Louise Gluck especially emphasized a lot about too much willfulness to try to make a poem. In other words, a poem needs to come by itself, and if you impose your will on it too thoroughly, you probably won't get a poem. And that was enlightening to me, because I'm a person who thinks, well, if I just go at it in a most determined manner, I'll be successful. But that's really not how poetry works. Believing in your own voice, all of them were very emphatic about that. No matter what the world's delivering to you at the moment, you need to believe in your voice. And read, and read, because unless you know what's come before you, what's happening at the same time as you, it will be hard to write poetry that works well. You have to read widely. I think that's a lot of beginning poets have a lot of trouble with that.
You are listening to KPTZ 91.9 FM, Port Townsend. In case you just joined us, you are listening to In Conversation with Sheila Bender, discussions on writing and the writing life. Sheila is speaking with Port Angeles poet Alice Derry about her years of teaching and writing poetry.
one of the things I think that's true about humans is that we actually all do have a poetic place in us. And we're not all compelled to write poetry, but those of us who are might be satisfied with what we think is the best job we can do writing a poem without looking at the ways learning can, by reading, can push us way further along in finding out our poetic soul than just being satisfied. And yet, I mean, I understand that it's awfully satisfying to just write a poem, and perhaps more of us should.
People should decide what their goals are. If their goals are that, then that's great. If their goals are to become a great published poet, they're going to have to go the harder, rockier route. But I'm certainly not saying you shouldn't write what you want to write and be happy with that.
Right. I agree with you. And I also agree that the harder route is very, very rewarding.
It is. Yeah. Of course. Yeah.
So, and there are so many poets to choose from. So I haven't really mentioned your website. Can people find out more of your work or maybe read some samples right there?
Each book is discussed on the website, and then a poem is given from each book. So you can find out a lot about me on the website.
And it is? Your website
is www.alicederry.com.
And that's regular spelling of Alice and Derry.
Yeah,
right?
One word.
Yeah. Thank you. So certainly we learn from our influences, both our teachers and also poets that came before us, as you mentioned. Sometimes we just learn from life experiences. And I'm wondering if you can name any of those life experiences. I know, well, your sheriff, obviously, is right there. And just being tuned to what is what you're reading, what's happening. But are there actual lessons about writing poetry, maybe that came from any personal experience?
Yeah, I guess when I was thinking about the answers to this question, I thought more about what I learned as opposed to how I learned that. But certainly it was my own childhood and then my own family that I had, my daughter and my husband, that brought me to understand that politics begins in the family. Every family poem is a political poem. And even though the domestic is so rarely rewarded in our time, it is essential to producing good citizens. That's the only way to produce a good citizen, and that's the only way to live in a world with peace. And so my poetry really focuses on the domestic and family relationships. When I was writing this out, I said the domestic is rarely rewarded, but is essential to a world with peaches instead of peace. And I thought it's still essential to a world with peaches also. Motherhood not only gave me the richness of being with my daughter, which has sustained me my whole life since she was born, but also opened up a whole new way for me to understand myself and what had gone on in my own life, and a certain kind of permission to be a kind of person that I was because I saw her being that person. And so those were really essential to writing poems, and you can see that in practically every poem I've written.
Would you like to read another poem right now?
Sure.
Thank you.
So this is the initial poem in Tremolo. Again, I chose it today because of our political situation and how I think it speaks to that. The poem is all centered around my mother's death, which now is fairly far in the past. So it's called Although I Laid Carnations. I wasn't there to wash my mother's body. The day before, yes. When the home nurse came, we cleaned her together, rolling her gently on her side so we could wipe away the feces, rolling her back to lift the two heavy breasts, dry the gathered sweat. And each time we touched, each time we moved her, she cried, "No, no, no," although she could hardly speak, had said her goodbyes 2 days before, making me listen. After his call, by the time I could get to her 3 hours away, my brother had already washed her and dressed her again in the flimsy hospital gown. But nothing in it of ceremony, although I laid carnations to frame her face and cover her crossed hands, thinking of Hamlet's mother and Ophelia, sweets to the sweet, thinking not even of the real, but of some other sore heart's imaginings to help me. 2. Walking into work in the early quiet where a few minutes alone is all I'll get today, I can try to imagine the rocky Shiite woman the radio has brought me. She is the one who keeps the dark stone house for the ceremonial washing of the Shiite dead. She didn't elect this work. 22, when I saw the first body, I said to myself, your 4 children will starve if you don't do this. The reporter describes how she begins by covering the genitals with a small square of white cloth. Onto the scalp she touches a circle of soap which widens to foam. The rinsed hair returns to ringlets. With a loofah sponge she scrubs the body until it emerges burnished, ready to be wrapped in white linen for burial. If pressed, she will tell you she has never gotten used to it. What was hardest, the woman they brought to her burned all over, clutching her baby so tightly they had to be washed together. 3. When friends ask, this first year my daughter's gone from home, don't you wish she was always a child holding to you? No, I say no. I want us to be able to let go, one body, then 2. From the tight embrace of the first years a child gathers herself to walk away. The air remains. This Shiite woman has given me a part of herself, her gift. As I stumble out of my car in the half-light of spring, all the birds back to help us hear air. Transubstantiation. One thing becomes another. Mere thought leads to the touchable child. As she feeds her children the evening meal, the woman who washes bodies knows well what flesh is made of, how necessary the solid body is, what becomes earth, its sure path. When her children crawl into her lap at bedtime, that's a different matter.
What is it like to write a poem in parts and allow yourself to use an image, say, of the mother and child burnt but united, and then answer that question, no, I want my child to walk away? The magic of poetry, for sure.
Yeah.
But how do you work when you're writing in parts? Do you know it will be a poem in parts?
Not hardly ever at the beginning do I know that. I'm a person who writes quick, rough drafts when the urge is on me and I have the inspiration and I have the words, and then later the poem is shaped. And probably I knew that the Shiite woman and my mother and my daughter were really closely connected. Otherwise, that radio report would not have touched me the way it did. But I doubt if I knew that those parts were there until I had started working on the poem. But shaping is, as far as I'm concerned, it's as important as what first comes.
But you said something really important, that you knew you emotionally were triggered by that interview you heard.
Yeah.
And it had to have been attached to something in your life. And I think all day long, many of us go through life feeling those little triggers, but it's the poet who sits down and stays there in that moment until it's been mined for what it wanted to tell you.
Yeah.
So I really
that's the
always
meditative
that.
Life. I mean, you know that from your own work in writing.
It's the thing that does keep us sane. I mean, it's very important, and it does feel, if you are a poet and compelled to do this work, and you can't for some reason, whether it's papers to grade or travels to be had, it can be really distressing. And I think that's a feeling, and you have to pay attention to what you did, which is it's time to sit down.
Yeah.
Write this.
Absolutely.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about the title of this book?
Oh, tremolo, yeah. It's a musical term, and it's opposed to the musical term trill. A trill is a repeated note that stands outside the time signature of the piece, but a tremolo has to make itself felt as a repeated note within the time signature. In other words, you don't get to go out there and be a little show-off. You have to work within what is given to you. The title poem came from my daughter talking to me about tremolo. She's a musician. I'm not, but she taught me a lot about music. It made me think about trembling, and of course the little line to this book, the epigraph, is from Retke, "This shaking keeps me steady." And that's really what this book is about. The shaking is, in other words, I have to go through the things I have to go through in my life, and I'm going to learn how to derive steadiness from that.
So poets are, among other things, courageous. Thank you for that description. It's wonderful to know. Titles are not easy sometimes, and they're not the first things sometimes that we do. But when we find the right one, it works on so many levels, as yours does.
Yeah. I agree. And of course, as soon as I thought that I wanted tremolo, somebody said to me, well, there's such and such a book named Tremolo. And I thought, that's okay.
It is okay. It's actually a copyright issue, and it's okay, which is a relief, I think, because it's more than okay. It's good. Before we hear another poem to close our conversation, why did you do the hard work of keeping a reading series going? You told us a little bit about in the network of poets you came to know, the audiences being there and delivering its nourishment to everybody. Is there anything else you want to say about that might encourage people to take on a reading series?
It is a lot of hard work, and I know that people don't do it for that reason, and it can have a lot of jagged edges that drive you kind of crazy. Poets themselves can be difficult to deal with, and then there's all the other things surrounding it. First of all, I was so privileged and honored to be able to bring good, really good, top-notch poetry to our community. And I know that people appreciated it and were nourished by it, just what you said. And that was enough payoff if there had been no other. But the other, of course, was for myself. I got to meet these people. I got to read their work. I got to be immersed in their work. I got to understand who they were, and some really nice friendships came out of it. But even when they didn't, somehow the work became richer and more meaningful because I had known the person.
Let's hear another poem before we close.
I thought I'd just read a little poem for fall when the salmon come back to the peninsula, and this is called Finding the Poem. And this takes place up on the Solduck River, which, by the way, is actually a Quilly word, solitak, which means sparkling water. And there's a salmon cascades there where you can see salmon jumping if you get to the right place at the right time. And it took me 25 years to do that. That was kind of embarrassing. But anyway, then the poem came. And the you in the poem is my husband. I'm speaking to my husband. Finding the poem. I'm good, you say, and go back to the car. How differently we need things. I could be here until dark comes down or rain, each fish making me content to wait as long as I need to until the next catapults skyward. It's not what we're allowed to call will, but they're up for it, slapping against the rocks if their aim isn't in line with the surging down current or landing in a shallow dish on top, which leads nowhere. A futile surge forward, then they let themselves be washed back and down. Some slip up the sides of this narrow chute or sluice through. Some shoot dead center, ruby bodies, nothing but muscle, heads iridescent green. So much takes place below what's churned white, I can't tell which fish make it and which must accept over and over a fall to slack water. The boiling on a rock shelf full of thrashing tails has to be the next step. Maybe 10 miles all they have left of the 60 they can reach up this river to channels and springs of their birth and spawning. Strands of silver stitching together our world, my friend writes. We know their story, carrying heart's blood high into the mountains, feeding animals and trees before sending their fry spiraling down to salt water again. Somewhere I read how difficult it is, their change to ocean, like being smothered. Discouraging, you say, when I come to the car, everything's going in one direction and you're going in another. They don't feel that way. I say salmon are built for their stream. Okay, you let go quietly. I don't press my point as I usually do. Stay as long as you want, you say. We've lost 3 parents in a short time, our arms raised, warding off blows. We're tender with one another. So I go back. I go back to watch how, water-bound and trying every other course first, they launch and fly, paddling air, bringing to its indifferent pressure its lassitude, which can't receive hard rowing, but asks for the lightness of bird bone, what they have to offer, mushing through as far as they can go, farther.
Thank you. Those lines are good for all of us today.
They are. They're important.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
In Conversation is produced by Sheila Bender and edited by Charlie Fleischman.